I was born here in Korea and I was educated here. Sometimes I do forget what's happening in Korea. But if you look at the headline news in the states or global media, they've been covering the Korean situation in a frantic ways, whatever.
Right.
But
they make it seem the war will be tomorrow.
Almost some there. But unbelievably, some war correspondent working CNN or global news media have been staying here in Korea. But suddenly, due to some bomb blast in Boston or some earthquakes in China, so they return back to the States or
they leave.
They left here. But anyway, I've been in IBK more than 33 years. So
really?
I'm almost some bankers. But after I read you some biographs, I have realized you are the right person for me to raise some questions regarding the relationships between South and North Korea. But as could understand, Korea financial market is not immune to the relationship between South and North Korea. So
Right, for sure.
But I want to ask one very important question to you in terms of your foreign specialist perspective. So I do believe there are so many pros cons, and I do believe advantages born to Korea. But what is some born handicaps given to Korean Peninsula, right? Historically,
it's a great question.
Geographically, or international relationships, whatever. So probably I do believe as you are specialists, you have studied the Korean Peninsula or some.
That's a great question. Well, I mean, I think one handicap is just the location, because, as my Korean friends put it, you're a minnow between whales, meaning you've got China, you have Russia, Japan, and the peninsula is comparatively small, but it's strategically located, so that even if America weren't involved, you would still have China and Russia and Japan all interested in what is happening on the Korean Peninsula, and that will never go away. I think another handicap that's related to that geographically is that you can't avoid the spillover that's going to come from the continent, particularly China. I mean, historically, it would come down through the peninsula and then work its way over to Japan. And you could still have that. I mean, you could still have unrest in China at some point in time, driving people into the peninsula because the north makes it a buffer, but people wanting to come to South Korea and wanting to be a part of here. So I think the biggest handicap Korea faces, is one you can't change, and that's geography, which is something that obviously, interestingly, I think a lot of people on the outside forget that the peninsula is for the Koreans, right? I mean, we're always thinking about what's China's interest and what's Japan's interest and what's Russia. No one ever asks, what are the Koreans' interest, right? It's your peninsula. So historically, you have these great powers all acting, and it's a very odd situation when you think about it, and that I think means that Korea always has to be a little bit better than everyone else, right? Because you have to deal with these big powers. So you have to be smarter, you have to be nimbler, you have to be able to move very quickly. But there's a lot of limitations, resource limitations, basically access to the global commons all goes through water areas that are controlled by others. So if you want to get to the Pacific Ocean, you have to go through Chinese or Japanese waters. There's a lot of restrictions on Korea, which is why I think, number one, it's done such a great job, and number two, America, I would argue, is pretty aware of this, and I think is very supportive of maintaining Korea as part of the global economy.
Absolutely.
Not part of just Asia or Northeast Asia, but the global economy.
In the long-term perspective, in the
long-term
macro perspective. Yeah.
Exactly. So.
Right, so you have described the handicaps mostly, but I don't believe due to the geographical locations, probably, if necessary, we can fully utilize the geographic situations, meaning looking right hand side mainland China, and the left hand side Japan,
Right.
and the northern part areas Russia. But in the long of Pacific areas, our big brother United States is always keeping us and paying attention to Korea situations, whatever.
Yeah, I think so.
But sometimes I don't believe Korea can play Joker.
The Joker?
Yeah, Joker. Joker
Yeah.
means we should be very smart. We should be very careful. And sometimes if we do make the best use of the geographical locations, sometimes we can use China in order to make counter attack or kind of joker face against the ever increasing Japanese military forces threatening Korea, mainland China, whatever, vice versa. Or sometimes we can use Russia in order to make countermeasures against this ever increasing powers coming from mainland China. How
Right.
can you recommend us in terms of a Korean perspective, how we can fully utilize the merit or the geographic the handicaps in the more good ways?
Well, like you said, I think Korea is always having to position itself politically where it is positioned geographically, meaning in the middle. Because if you ever really tied yourself to one power or the other, in the region, then the others would see you as not an independent player, but as an appendage of China or an appendage of Japan, and therefore the balancing act that Korea can do would disappear. So in that sense, as you said, you complete the joker in the pack to work with China when Japan starts acting in ways that you're not happy with, which is often, or work with Russia in terms of China, or even, I would argue, more Japan in terms of China, means I think that Korea will always find itself part of everything but alone, if I can put it that way. Now, from the American perspective, we really always want Korea to be part of our grouping, our bloc, and I think in many ways it is. I mean, Korea is a democracy. It's a free economy.
Yes.
It is now providing public goods. I mean, Korean military forces are around the world, either operating with the U.S. or the UN or however they are. Obviously, Korean students are all around the world in business. So the U.S., I think, sees Korea naturally as being part of the global community and wants it to be part of the liberal, democratic global community. But when you come back here, home, to Asia, then immediately there's that balancing aspect, Japan, Russia, China, that Korea has to take into account. And I think that's sometimes hard for the U.S. To understand. One of the biggest issues I'll mention for the U.S. is why can't Korea and Japan work more closely together? Because from our perspective, it's natural. You're both democracies. You both obviously are allies with the U.S. You both have the same concerns about North Korea. And to be frank, you have the same concerns about China. So the Washington perspective is that Korea and Japan should be working much more closely together.
Yes.
And that doesn't happen, and so Washington gets very concerned and frustrated. But I think that it's an issue of hopefully of time, and the two, Tokyo and Seoul, understanding that their interests are really pretty closely aligned. But on the other hand, we all have to understand that Korea must see itself as playing that independent role of part of everything but independent.
But looking back to the long years of our history between Japan and Korea,
Yes.
Not always good friend relationship. Most of the times distorted, unfriendly relationships, or sometimes war or something like
Yes.
that. Rooted in such long animosity or unfriendly relationships, it is not easy.
Right.
for Korea to maintain always a good relationship with Japan. But sometimes, as good pinpoint, in the long-term perspective, in the more broader perspective, Korea, Japan, United States are democratic society, democratic country, and are typically very good free economic systems, whatever system there. We should be more cooperative, so, but time to time, probably U.S. influence might be needed to settle the small dispute. But in the more big picture system, Korea, Japan should remain good friend each other in order to survive each other. Otherwise, no either good way for Japan and Korea and the United States. So we fully understand this. But internally, and we have a certain limit beyond which we cannot cross.
Right.
We are moderate. We are controlling our stance among some political groups and the economists or businessmen, whatever. But anyway, listen to what I've noticed regarding the relationship in Southeast Asia. I'm personally, I don't believe, I have noticed the small change of the relationship structures, meaning, as you can understand this, United States has been remained a very close ally. But since mainland China has opened its their door and has begun to do their economic development due to the geographical or the historical relationships, China has emerged the largest trade partner.
Right.
And gradually, Korean economy is beginning to be dependent on the mainland China economic influence.
Right.
Nowadays, many Korean manufacturing companies have moved their factory from Korea to mainland China. And so if the mainland China economic situation is not doing good job, Korea is not safe either. And also, it is not our the expected scenarios. The other is our intentions. So gradually, economic perspective, Korea is too heavily dependent on mainland China. But except the economic ties, still militarily, diplomatically, United States is our most high reliable partners.
Right.
So it is not good situation either. And for the North Korea perspective, long years, mainland China, all the political groups have been so cooperative, have been so supportive to the North Koreans, regardless their character level to act.
Right.
Probably their first their nuclear test or fire long missiles, whatever. The previous the political groups in mainland China was always very friendly to North Korea. But nowadays, Xi Jinping or the younger leader groups have taken power in China, but slightly, probably mainland China is changing its stance to North Korea. Under these scenarios, how can we cope with this changes in the relationship structures between South and North Korea and the relationship for Korea, South Korea to the United States and for North Korea to the mainland China?
Yeah, well, first on the North Korea side, everyone hopes that China is changing. I don't really believe it. I think they may be angry and they're frustrated with Pyongyang, but it doesn't mean that they're going to end their support or really help the United States put pressure on North Korea or the like. My sense is more that North Korea can continue to count on Chinese support. But as you mentioned, in terms of the economics, everyone's dependent on China. The United States is dependent. Japan is dependent. South Korea is dependent. Everyone's dependent on China, which is a good thing. It's good for our economies because we're able to get or certainly have goods assembled there more cheaply, get goods more cheaply. It benefits our consumers. It's obviously good for China because it has helped China become richer and therefore China to become far less isolated. You know, China is more part of the world economy now than it ever was, and it continues each year to become more part of the world economy. And we hope ultimately that will lead it to changing some of its policies that we see as disruptive or not supportive. But at the same time, you know, we have the Korea-U.S. FTA, the KORUS FTA, which was just finally ratified last year or the year before. So even as Korea has grown closer to China economically, and the United States has grown closer to China economically, we still are pursuing our own economic ties together. There is obviously the TPP, which Japan has now announced it is going to join, and we hope Korea will join too because of the benefits that come from free trade. So I think that there is so much integration that can occur economically that we don't have to be too concerned about Korea becoming overly reliant on China because Korea is a global power. Now, other countries may become overly reliant, and I think they are. Some like Cambodia and Laos are overly reliant on China. Probably Mongolia as well. Taiwan is not, but is in danger of becoming overly reliant. I don't think that'll happen to Korea, South Korea, but it's a balance to try to push our interests of economic relations, even as both of our countries get closer to China. So again, all of it I think is a balance. I think if China were smarter, they would really be looking. You know, if China really wanted to develop a relationship with South Korea, they'd have a different North Korean policy. And if China really wanted to create a stable relationship with Japan, well, it would do other things a little bit differently. So I think that China continues to evolve. China continues to grow, and hopefully will one day recognize that it needs policies that are in which it must compromise somewhat on its own interests in order to create trusting relationships with other countries. Right now, it's not there. I mean, look, China has no allies in Asia except North Korea, Laos, and Cambodia. It used to be Myanmar, but you know, Burma has changed. I mean, and those are not, you know, if you're Beijing, those are not countries you want to have as allies because they're net negatives for China. They're not net positives. So China doesn't have many close friends. Interestingly, neither does Japan in Asia, right? So the two largest economies in Asia, the two largest countries in Asia, don't have any allies. They don't have any real friends. That's not a good situation. I was going to say dangerous. I don't know if it's dangerous, but it's not very good to have that because it shows that Asian political, economic, security relations are still very, very fragile. If you don't have China or Japan having real allies, it's because the other nations either fear them in the case of China or resent them in the case of Japan. And that's not healthy for the region.
Well, when we are always talking about the superpowers surrounding Korean Peninsula, so we are always calling four superpowers: United States, China, Japan, and Russia. But recently, I have noticed that Russia is interested in keeping a low profile regarding current crisis between South and North Korea. You see some kind of indications of China, Russia's policies on Korean Peninsula, or is it due to their internal political situations, whatever?
That's a great question. I think it's probably because Russia really doesn't have a lot that it can bring to the table. It doesn't have major trade relations the way China does with North Korea. Russia's trade relations with South Korea are still relatively limited. They're not tiny, but they're limited. Russia's focus continues to be European Russia, the West, and the East is, you know, it's a huge treasure house of natural resources that primarily are going to China right now, with a little bit going to Japan. But my sense is that the Russians really just don't feel they have a lot of equities to play in the Korean Peninsula. I mean, it's they want to be seen as a great power and therefore part of the six-party process or whatever process we have for dealing multilaterally with North Korea. But there's not, they can't really bring a lot of economic weight to the table. They don't have political influence, and they don't have much security weight anymore either. They're trying to rebuild, but right now it's pretty limited. So it is interesting that Russia, which has always been such a major player in Northeast Asia, is relatively quiet. Whether it will stay that way is another question, but right now it's not much they can do.
I see. And but out of the long-term perspective, South Korea should get ready for the eventual unification between North and South Korea, just like West Germany had done. But then, how can we financing financial cost to make some constructions of a highway or to supply some electric power, so whatever.
Well, it will be the world's greatest reconstruction development program ever. Well, except maybe after World War II. The cost will be enormous. I'm not even sure anyone's ever really figured out what it would cost. But you could see where it would be a lot of potential opportunity for businesses to invest in developing North Korea. But I don't know, I mean, talk with younger South Koreans and they're not as eager for reunification. I mean, I've noticed that. It's no secret. Older South Koreans do want reunification. So if it continues on for another 20 years or so, when today's young people will be middle-aged or older, now maybe reunification would be a much harder process because they're not as committed to it. The older generation remembers, they want reunification, but the younger generation might be more hands-off, in which case, if the North Korean regime fell and there was the possibility of reuniting the peninsula, it could be a much more difficult process than we think of today. I mean, because today there are people in charge who would want to drive that forward and make it happen. In 20 years, there may not be those people. The South Koreans may feel they have to, but there wouldn't be the real passion for it, and therefore the process could be much less, they could be less committed to it, they could do it not as strongly, not as completely. I mean, there's a lot of ways in which I would be very worried, in which reunification in 25 years may be a less complete process than what you would see today.
Okay, and final question. Probably the Kaesong Industrial Complex is very good example. The symbol between South and North Korea in terms of reducing tensions or overcoming the difference between North and South Korea. But nowadays, I do believe temporarily it's been closed due to political reasons by North Korea. How can we solve the close of the Kaesong Industrial Park?
Well, I think what you're raising is the fact that for North Korea, politics trumps everything. It's always about the politics and the security. No matter how much economic activity there is at Kaesong, no matter how much it's a symbol, as you said, they'll shut it down because they know they can use it. And if that's the case, then I think there's very little that South Korea can actually do to change that dynamic, because the change has to happen in Pyongyang. They have to think differently, and they have to understand that their future, if they want a future that's better than today, but maybe they don't, but if they want a future that's better than today, it's to do things like Kaesong and more of that, and opening up. Until that change happens in Pyongyang, I don't think there's anything Seoul can do. But if the change happens in Pyongyang, then Kaesong will become irrelevant because everything will change, right? Everything will open up. So the North has to open up its mindset, and then everything else can change. Right now, Kaesong is just, it's a hostage to the North.
Okay, yeah, I have heard so many the analysis of the Korean financial situations. So your analysis is so deep, rooted, and very the foresight. And thank you very much for your the advice. So I will convey your advice to the policymakers or some prime meetings or whatever. And some financial news is one of the influential medias here. Probably they will broadcast your message to the policymakers.
I hope so. Okay. I'll look forward to it.
Okay. Thank you
so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.